Who was Athanasius Kircher? A man whose life spanned most of the 17th century. Kircher was a product of the Jesuit college tradition and German mechanical know-how. Born in a town near Fulda, in the maelstrom of the 30 Years' War, a Catholic in a mostly Protestant region of Germany, Kircher was somebody who, by his early 20s, became known for his mechanical ingenuity. At the height of his career, he would be one of the most well-known and admired creators of early modern machines. Beloved by people who thought he had found the secrets to absolutely everything, and reviled by others who thought he knew absolutely nothing. In many respects, Kircher was an heir to the Renaissance traditions of natural magic that are best embodied by the Neapolitan magus Giambattista della Porta, whose natural magic was one of the best sellers of the 16th and 17th century. As an heir to della Porta, Kircher saw himself as a Catholic magus, a man who would, with great piety and learning, unlock all of the secrets of the world and also reveal the idols, right, the false as well as the true knowledge that the world had to offer. Now, the 17th century was a great era to think with machines. By the 1610s, the telescope and early version of the microscope had both begun to circulate as instruments that would transform, respectively, the sciences of astronomy and natural history. New improvements in measuring devices, timekeeping devices, and a whole variety of other things multiplied across the 17th century. The 1630s and 40s, the early phase, an exciting phase of Kircher's career, was a great age of experimental physics. It laid the groundwork for a full-fledged instrumental science. Right, so Kircher was a man born at an absolutely important moment in the history of instruments. By the 1640s, for instance, Evangelista Torricelli would invent a tube that began to raise the question of how to produce a vacuum, whether or not there was a vacuum in nature. And you actually see here from one of the books published by Kircher's disciple, Caspar Schott, an image of an experiment that Kircher and Schott did with their colleagues at the Roman College, where they're using Torricelli's tube and using the building of the Roman College in Rome, to try and sort of test this idea, of a vacuum, which they didn't believe existed, unlike Torricelli. Torricelli's tube would spawn a whole variety of other instruments. Barometers, thermometers were new instruments of the 1640s and 50s. By the 1660s, air pumps, microscopes, and all sorts of other instruments had become the staple of a new experimental science. Well, Kircher himself was not on the side of the moderns, right, who advanced what we think of as the core principles of the scientific revolution. He was nonetheless at the center of this excitement and wonder about what one could do with instruments and the way in which instruments not only could expand one's understanding of nature, but themselves replicate the basic processes of the natural world. Now, from, it seems, almost his youth, Kircher participated in this instrumental curiosity. We know that by the early 1620s, he was building sundials and clocks in the Jesuit colleges, first in Koblenz, and then in Helgenstadt, and finally in Würzburg. He was well known enough for this kind of instrumental ingenuity that the Archduke Ferdinand III asked him to build what was called a pentameter, otherwise known as the Baroque slide rule, which is not an unimportant instrument in this period and one that is much discussed, right? How much mathematical knowledge can you get into the slide rule to sort of improve the ability to calculate? Equally important, while Kircher struggled with ideas about light, time, quantification, he also began his studies of magnetism. And what I've put up here, I've tried to put throughout this talk examples of efforts to reproduce Kircher's machines. This is one that we have at Stanford from an exhibit that we did a good number of years ago now. It's a magnetic clock that's in Green Library at Stanford University, and it's designed to be a replica of the magnetic clock that you see here in the image accompanying it. which is, in this instance, shows you the backside, right, how it really works. This is a clock that seemingly is self-moving, in which this fish sort of points in any direction and keeps sort of moving around, mysteriously by time, and then Kircher instead sort of reveals the mechanism, right? It's not really the cosmos, it's the ingenuity of the inventor that actually makes this happen. This is a great example of the kinds of magnetic machines that became the staple of his reputation as one of the great inventors of the 17th century. Now, why magnetism? What was it about magnetism that inspired people in this period? At the beginning of the 17th century, the English physician William Gilbert had published a book in 1600 called On Magnetism. In this important book, Gilbert made the seemingly invisible and occult powers of the magnet empirically demonstrable. And he suggested, moreover, that understanding the magnet, understanding this tiny little piece of nature, was the key to understanding the cosmos. Without absolutely saying so, he opened the path for people to imagine that studying the magnet in microcosm would be one of the first steps in accepting a heliocentric worldview, right, built on the writings of Copernicus from 1543. And to give you an example of the longevity of this idea, when Isaac Newton was a young university student in the 1660s in Cambridge, one of the first things that he studied, reading books of natural magic like Delaporte's and Kircher's, was the magnet. Right, before he came up with his ideas about gravity, he thought about the magnet, right, as the first object that would unlock the secrets of nature. So the magnet as the ultimate key to the secrets of nature was much on people's minds in the 17th century. And sure enough, we see Kircher moving from building, simply raw mechanical sundials to these more sophisticated mechanical clocks and other magnetic demonstrations. I think many of Kircher's early examples of magnetic devices were inspired directly by reading Delaporte's Natural Magic. In his Natural Magic, Delaporte had talked about his magnetic table that he delighted viewers with who came to his house in Naples. So what was the magnetic table? Right, the magnetic table was, a metal table on which he had put all of these magnetized filings, and underneath he had several magnets that he would manipulate to create seemingly, right, by invisible forces, armies, right, which sort of form and dance across the table, and this was a great example of what Delaporte thought natural magic was. For Delaporte, natural magic was, as he put it, the practical part of natural philosophy, right? It was a demonstration of the forces of nature, and often a delightful and whimsical demonstration of the kind as the magnetic table. So improving upon Delaporte, Kircher continued this trend. We know that by the late 1620s and early 1630s, when he was teaching as a young professor at the Jesuit college in Würzburg, that he created a number of interesting demonstrations that combined his faith with his knowledge. For instance, a magnetic demonstration of Jonah swallowed by the whale. We, alas, have no image of this. Jonah swallowed by the whale, and of course what he did was he put a magnet inside the whale, right, so that slowly Jonah, right, the metal Jonah would be drawn into the whale and then thrown out. Regurgitation is also, as my colleague Michael John Gorman has pointed out in a wonderful article on Kircher's machines, regurgitation is an important part of the Baroque machine, and Kircher was no exception to that rule. What he also did, apropos of water, but not regurgitation, was to create a resurrection machine, which seemed to be almost heretical. In the resurrection machine, he had put a magnet inside of Paul, right, so that, that Christ would then rise up. And as he said at one point in this discussion, what he hoped was that when people tried to replicate his resurrection machine, they would make Christ a very flexible metal so Christ would seem to bend as he rose out of the water. So needless to say, already in his 20s, Kircher was reputed to be somewhat of a marvel, right, a curiosity himself, to such a degree that there were already rumors circulating that he was a natural magician, perhaps of a diabolical kind. So at a very early point in his life, Kircher has to defend, what he's trying to do. Why are you creating a resurrection machine? And his point is that in the end, making instruments is a way of revealing the truth, right? It takes nothing away from the miracle, but it's a demonstration, of the way in which we need to understand what is truly a miracle and what instead might be merely natural or mechanical, right? What he's constantly trying to do is to sort of make these divisions. What he also is trying to do is to show through these tiny machines all of the things that matter in his world. So for instance, again, to kind of point you to some examples that we do have images of, one of the many early clocks he made was this clock that's called the universal horoscope, right? And this is a great example of the world that Kircher lives in the 17th century, especially as a Jesuit, because this is a universal clock, right, that tells you time all over the world. And his image of all over the world is very much shaped by wherever the Jesuit missions are. You know, eventually Kircher would create another version of this clock that actually tied the universal clock to a tree of the genealogy of the Jesuit order. And I actually once or twice have done, replicas of this with these postdocs that worked with me at Stanford some years ago, where, we set up a darkened room, and we put up his tree of the Jesuit order. And indeed, if you got the light just the right way on the pinhole, once the light came through Rome, it would come down the dial and illuminate perfectly, the different times and all the different parts of the world, one after another. So the mastery of light, of time, of the invisible forces, such as the magnet, were absolutely at the core of what Kircher was trying to do. Now, at the same time, Kircher, being a learned Jesuit, was also developing his skills in ancient languages, ancient and esoteric languages, I would say, that would ultimately culminate in his reputation as the Baroque decoder of the hieroglyphs. Yes, prior to the Rosetta Stone, many people believed that Kircher had unlocked the mystery of mysteries, right? This ancient language that everyone was fascinated with and no one knew. And as a number of people, especially Daniel Stolzenberg, have pointed out, Kircher created, one true step and multiple false steps. His true step was to understand that indeed modern Coptic, bore a relationship to ancient Egyptian, to this hieroglyphic language. But after that, what Kircher did, as he did with much of his other work, was to sort of be fascinated with the potential symbology of the hieroglyph. So the rest of his interpretation of the hieroglyph had nothing to do with linguistics as a modern science and everything to do with this cosmology in which he lived. Language for him was also like a magnet, right? It was an invisible force, to be unlocked and decoded in various ways. And so, needless to say, by 1633, when finally the religious and political events of the 30 Years' War caught up with the city of Würzburg, and Kircher was forced to flee Germany permanently to southern France, he was a man who brought many secrets with him. He then arrived in the city of Avignon and set up shop in 1633, perfecting and expanding his repertoire of inventions. He first challenged everyone with his mechanical ingenuity by creating a fabulous indoor sundial in the Jesuit College of Avignon that now began not just to use his knowledge of magnets, right, and of light, but also to begin to demonstrate his facility with mirrors. This was a sundial that was not only inside the college, but also had all of these optical mirrors on the outside of the tower, to deflect light in all sorts of interesting ways to create, the movements of the heavens, right, especially of the sun and the moon on the walls inside. A demonstration of his early interest in optics that he would continue to evolve for a number of decades. But perhaps most famous from this brief period of about a year or less that he spends in the city of Avignon was the creation of one of my favorite of Kircher's machines, the sunflower clock. And what I've done is shown you here, since later in this lecture series, David Wilson will come from the Museum of Jurassic Technology. I wanted to at least give you one or two examples of his replicas of Kircher's machines, and one of my favorites is the replica that he does of the sunflower clock. So for a period of about 2 years, Kircher amazed and puzzled all sorts of well-known contemporaries with the tales of the sunflower clock. So let's stop for a second and ask ourselves what exactly this heliotrope is up to. So the sunflower clock for Kircher was a great example, again, of the universal properties of magnetism, right? For him, the sunflower, the heliotrope was a magnet, right? It turned to the sun, not because of warmth or light, but because instead it was circulating, it was moving, with those occult movements of the universe that he was trying to study. So how to replicate that, right? How to show the world, that magnets are absolutely universal. So Kircher puts a sunflower on a floating cork, in which, of course, there is a hidden magnet, that will then connect with the metal band above that has the hours of the day on it. And slowly but surely he has it move around. He quickly realizes that having a full-fledged flower is a problem because every time the wind blows, the flower moves too fast, so the demonstration is unsatisfactory. So he then sort of redoes the experiment, and he claims that he goes to the market in Marseille where he meets an Arabic merchant who says, if you give me your signet ring, I have some magical seeds with special properties. So he takes these magical seeds, or at least this is what he tells people later on who are dubious about the first experiment, and now he puts just the seeds, the heliotropic seeds, on top of the cork, and of course they now move perfectly, right? No problems with the wind anymore. Or at least in his mind they do. His French colleagues were highly skeptical, both curious and highly skeptical, because it seemed from their perspective that he was not only reluctant to really do a full demonstration, but to the extent that he showed them anything, it never seemed to really quite work. When colleagues in Avignon and other cities nearby wrote to Descartes about them, Descartes simply wrote back and said, I don't even need to see it, this is impossible, right? So from the start, Descartes had his interpretation of Kircher, which was, a man full of absolute bunk. Well, needless to say, the answer to all the skepticism was, to continue onward to a better venue. By the end of 1633, Kircher had left southern France and moved to the city of Rome, where he would spend the vast majority of the rest of his life. He arrived in Rome at the principal institution of the Society of Jesus, the Roman College, the premier educational institution, where he would become professor of mathematics and Oriental languages, though fairly quickly he was considered so important to the public activities of the Roman College and of the society that he was quickly exempted from his duties. So Kircher was one of the early research professors, shall we say. Though he did actually accumulate a number of disciples, who were enormously loyal to him, and many of whom helped him in the building and publicity surrounding his machines. In Rome, Kircher replicated the sunflower clock once again. He initially met with great success, and then at a certain point he decided that perhaps he should retire this instrument and go back to his other, much more mechanical examples of the principles of magnetism. On a trip to Malta, one of the few trips he takes in his life away from Rome, he built what he called the Maltese Observatory. This is basically a wind machine, right? This magnetic machine does two things. You can see at the top an eagle. Kircher's machines are filled with eagles because even though he never set foot in Germany or Central Europe, he was nonetheless acutely conscious that some of the most important patrons for a German anywhere in the world were the Habsburg emperors, and so any opportunity to put an eagle on a machine or in his book was always welcome. Right, so here, even in Malta, we have this machine. So the eagle is on top, and this time he's now using the wind productively, right? The wind moves the eagle. You can then see in this instance, right, the long, tube connecting to the crank that then moves the dial on the outside, of this wind machine. But at the same time, what it also does is it activates, a crank within this globe, right? I mean, so many of Kircher's machines involve glass, just as Rachel has done in the exhibit, right? These glass globes that enclose some sort of magnetized object. In this case, he made a little tiny replica of the wind god, Aeolus, and put it inside this so that seemingly the wind god would point to the right direction, right, simply because the wind had blown, right? That was the mystery, that you had to figure out. And like so many of Kircher's machines, there was sort of a dual, purpose there. One was for the audience who got the joke and could read the books that he and his disciples would publish in this endlessly erudite, Latin, with all these illustrations that would sort of show you how the machine worked from the inside and explain what it did. And the other was just the sort of raw experience of walking in to any space in which he'd created one of these machines and just asking yourself, how did he do it, right? If you couldn't see inside the box, you didn't know, you had to guess, how did he do it? He had seemed to make the wind god move every time the wind blew. Similarly, this magnetic oracle that has been reproduced by David Wilson, also in the Museum of Jurassic Technology, is a great example of Kircher's sense of showmanship, right? His machines were never purely instrumental. They always served a rhetorical, we would say maybe even a metaphysical function. In fact, I would sort of argue that Kircher really is probably the strongest advocate of the metaphysical properties of machines. So the magnetic oracle is basically the Baroque Ouija board, right? You ask this questions about the cosmos, about the movements of the heavens, and the magnet beneath the table turns the figures inside the globe so they point to the answer that you need to know, right? So you move the dial in the front and it begins to move all sorts of things that are underneath the table. You can see how this is right out of Della Porta's idea of the magnetic table, right, as the place from which you can do all sorts of manipulations, right? Beneath the table, lies the mechanical answer, but on top, the mystery still remains a mystery. I mean, in so many ways, Kircher either invents or claims to invent many of the things that we still enjoy to play with, right? I mean, we still enjoy the idea of the Ouija board for the exact same reasons, I think, that, that Kircher had in mind when he did this, without a magnet, needless to say. Now, the question was, as time went on, how to really fully display all these wonderful machines that Kircher was creating. As a professor at the Roman College, Kircher was a Jesuit among many others, yes, exempted from teaching, but he had a room, like most other people, that he had stuffed increasingly with his curiosities and wonders and books and other things. Overflowing to capacity, people would talk about entering this room in the 1630s and 40s as his reputation grew because of his publications, and being just amazed at all the projects that were on his table. By the end of his life, over 50 books bore his name on the front page, and there were a whole string of other books published about his research by his disciples. Well, in 1651, Kircher was given a fortunate gift. A Roman noble named Alfonso Donino had decided to donate his collection of art and antiquities to the Roman College to give them the materials for a museum. The Jesuits accepted this donation. In return, they buried Donino in the church of San Ignazio, their principal church that they had been building right nearby, and they also began to think about who could be in charge of this museum. So as of 1651, Kircher found himself the curator of the Roman College Museum, that by the end of his life would not be known as the Roman College Museum, but as the Kircherian Museum. Because he was really the person who made it, one of the most visited sites in all of Rome for the next century. Now, this is the one image that we have of the Roman College Museum. It's an image that appears in the museum catalog that's published in 1678. And this is an image that does all sorts of wonderful optical things. One of the things we never knew until fairly recently was, exactly what this museum looks like. We have some architectural plans, we have, certain, descriptions by visitors of the space, but we're left with this image of this kind of endless, towering vista that seems to open up to the heavens, which is exactly what, the engraver, sort of captured, I think, very well. The kind of cosmological effect that this museum was supposed to have. And if you took this image literally, you would believe that these obelisks were as large as they seem to appear, right, with these very tiny people. I mean, look at the people in relationship to the size of the vases, for instance, and you can immediately see, the play that's going on here. Well, as it happened, sometime in, I think it was towards the end of the 1990s, the Roman College Museum, the old building there, is actually nowadays a high school, and they found some of the stuff in the basement, including the obelisk, which turned out to be about this big. So the illusion, right, of this museum was always far greater, than its reality. But I nonetheless wanted to give you a little kind of close-up, right, in a way, of course, that a 17th century reader of the book couldn't do, of this sort of image of Kircher greeting visitors in front of the world's most enormous obelisks that look as large as the obelisks that are all throughout Rome that he was helping to decipher and interpret. For any of you who've ever been to Piazza Navona, for instance, the inscriptions on Bernini's famous fountain under the obelisk were created by Kircher, right? He was the obelisk consultant of 17th century Rome. But he was also the P.T. Barnum of 17th century Rome. In the Roman College Museum, Kircher was able to fully realize his dream of creating a space, a perfect venue for his machines and curiosities. So, in the midst of completing his culminating work on the hieroglyphs and Egyptology, Kircher began to fill this museum with his objects. and also to expand, I think, the repertoire of objects because he had more space in which to show these things off. So for instance, inspired by the work that he was doing at the time on Egypt, he began to replicate Egyptian objects that he had read about, in ancient or Renaissance texts. Water clocks, the Colossus of Memnon, right, which was supposedly, a statue that had the demon inside it that spoke, right, following the Hermetic text that suggested that Egyptian priests had the power of making statues talk by putting the soul or a demon inside of it. Kircher chose to sort of replicate and debunk it at the same time to show that this was purely mechanical, right, it was purely a function of acoustics and tubes, and not false gods, instead. Replicating not only Egyptian but Greek machines were a big part of the activities that went on in the 1650s and 60s. The machine for Kircher, as he said at one point explicitly, was also a hieroglyph, right? He calls it a Machina Cryptographica, at one point. And I think this actually was one of his original views of a machine. That I can't think of anyone else in this period who actually says that explicitly, that the machine is also a hieroglyph. It's also something, but it's a hieroglyph that's been made for its time, just as the hieroglyphs of Egypt were made for their time. He also thought that one of the things he could do was to best the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, who was reputed by the Middle Ages and certainly by the Renaissance to be a wizard of fabled proportions as well as a great mathematician, a man who invented burning mirrors. Kircher and his contemporaries spent endless hours trying to replicate Archimedes' burning mirror experiments, or the recreation of the dove of Archytas, the flying dove, right, that Kircher said in the end was not about magic, but about magnets, right? His replica of the dove of Archytas was about a magnet that allowed the bird to move around the room in various ways. So lots and lots of replicas of ancient machines, and also lots of technological whimsy. Again, when we go down to the banal, right? The banal, aspect of Kircher's museum, he knew how to entertain. When I say that he was a Baroque P.T. Barnum, I really mean this. And the vomiting lobster, is the epitome of this. This was one of many, many ordinary objects scattered throughout Kircher's museum, that regurgitated all sorts of liquids. And again, these were ideas drawn straight from reading Hero of Alexandria's Pneumatics. And mechanics, right, in which there are all sorts of hydraulic and pneumatic machines in which you can drink wine and water, that can regurgitate different liquids, and Kircher improved upon these with things like the vomiting lobster. The museum became, for him also, the venue in which to fully realize his fascination with optical demonstrations. As instruments became more important to 17th century science, the understanding of lenses and mirrors also became much more sophisticated, and manipulating lenses and mirrors was one of the hallmarks, right, of being a good instrumentalist in the 17th century sense. So I'm going to take you through at this point a few examples of Kircher's optics. You see, for instance, here his fascination with reflection and refraction, obviously understood in a pre-Newtonian sense, right? Newton's optics has not been written yet. But he certainly is doing what the starting point for what Newton does is exactly what Kircher's doing. He's creating dark rooms with pinholes in which all sorts of glass artifacts, right? All sorts of shaped glass is being used, to produce, images on the wall. And you can see here, for instance, if you look in the lower, the lower right image, that Kircher has basically invented the disco ball. And he talks about it in this way. He says, if you go into this room and you look at this kind of great shaped turning object that I've made entirely of glass, you'll be inside a spectrum of color like you've never seen before, So I sort of occasionally like to think that, part of the experience of going to this museum was like the Studio 54 of Baroque Rome, as you went inside and you had this kind of transcendental experience and saw lots of things. But what he didn't do, of course, is what Newton does, right, which is to analyze the spectrum of color that comes out of these things, or why it happens, right? The sort of mathematical physical principles, were not what he was seeking. It was the effect, not the cause, right? Every instrument that Kircher does is about the effect, and almost never really about the cause in a kind of, scientific sense. Or if we look at the other image I put here, we can see Kircher again going back to his friend Della Porta. Della Porta had talked about these sort of fascinating experiments that he and his friends in Naples had supposedly been doing when, under the proper circumstances, they could sit in rooms and they would sort of see themselves wearing the heads of animals, right? Their identity would change. So Kircher thought, okay, so how can this happen, right? How can I redo this experiment? So he created this turning glass, cylinder here that you see, right? The turning glass cylinder, you stood in the exact right place, the mirror above it brought the sun in that reflected down, and if you looked up into the mirror, and had somebody turning it at the same time, you would indeed seem to have the head of an ass, right? Or, whatever animal you wished, out of this. So these are the kinds of optical experiments that Kircher's engaged in. What he also was doing was thinking about the way in which, using mirrors, one could also replicate, the way in which religious messages are revealed. And you see again, if you look at the right-hand image here, you'll see Kircher revealing, right, important messages in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, including, peace be with you, right, to pick the sort of simple one, at the bottom. And this is a great example of the way you can see him combining different interests, right, his interest in language, and obviously his religious, beliefs with optics. Light, right, fiat lux, lux is God, right? There is divine light and there is human light. And one of the jobs of the 17th century Catholic instrumentalist, of the kind that Kircher was to show that connection between the divine, perfect, and human, imperfect light, right? To bring the word, down, to sort of show you that process in a certain way, which again, like the resurrection machine, seems to us to be almost heretical, but we have to think about these things as being in a proper framework, right? He's not diminishing the miracle, but he's providing a demonstration, of this to remind you of the miracle. But I think of all of his optical machines, the most delightful, without a doubt, was the catoptric chest, which is on the left here. Now, the catoptric chest was a mirrored chest that was sort of like a Baroque funhouse. It really was a Baroque funhouse. And Kircher and his assistant Kaspar Schott described the reaction of people to all the artifacts they put inside the catoptric chest. They put money inside it and all sorts of jewels and other treasures to watch people try to grab what they thought was a massive, seemingly infinite quantity of something that was worth something, right? That turned out to be a single object and not even reachable, because they'd hidden it in a certain way. It was sort of like a vanitas, basically, to sort of remind you that in the end, these are things that are worth absolutely nothing. Once again, the catoptric chest also had a moral message through the machine. Less moral, like many 17th century experimentalists, Kircher was fascinated with what one could do with animals. This is an age in which Robert Boyle is constantly sucking the air out of animals inside the air pump. Kircher instead didn't do that, as far as we know. He was less interested in that kind of animal experiment. What he did do was to stick animals inside the catoptric chest. He was especially delighted with what happened with cats, who would look at their reflection. We'd put a single cat inside the chest. The cat would seem to see a zillion other cats and would run around trying to get the other cats. And he thought this was absolutely delightful, as did everyone else, right? Again, Kircher, as this kind of producer of spectacle, was without parallel. Just as Kircher thoroughly explored the instrumental possibilities of light in all of these different machines, he also complemented this with an ongoing fascination with the properties of sound. Kircher was sure that there was a direct physical relationship between sound and light. Sound didn't simply act like light, it literally was like light. And to this end, he built all sorts of acoustic and musical machines that have ever since made him of interest to musicologists. As one musicologist who's written about him has suggested, Kircher himself probably had very little interest in the tonal properties of music, but he was fascinated with the making of sound. And we see this in all sorts of ways in his work. Now, what I've done here is just to remind you, just briefly before I turn to some of his images, of examples. These are, again, modern reconstructions of some of Hero of Alexandria's pneumatic machines, the drinking bird, to sort of show you the inspiration for the vomiting lobster, but also this other machine with an owl and a set of birds that made the birds sing, right? The owl turns, as the tank empties and fills with water, the owl either turns or the birds begin to whistle. Right. In fact, one thing I actually have to thank Rachel Berwick for is I've been thinking, because of her installation, about how important birds are to the culture of machines from antiquity through the 17th century. There are so many machines that attempt to replicate bird song, or the movement of birds, right, to make birds fly, right, or sing. Seems to have been one of the enduring fascinations of the makers of machines throughout the centuries. Kircher, again, was right at the forefront of these developments. And what I put here is an example of one of the other legendary machines that Kircher had read about. He had read Hero of Alexandria's pneumatics in a manuscript copy that he found inside the Vatican Library when he was doing his research on Egyptology. And he said, okay, I can do better than Hero, right? He made a magnetic trumpeter, I can do all sorts of things. And he began to do them inside the Roman College. He turned the Roman College into this vast acoustic theater in which he produced some of the most fabulous speaking trumpets of the 17th century. And here you can see one example of this, a big acoustic machine, that leads up to a statue upstairs. Visitors came in, and whatever they said was echoed through the statue, right? This is how you make a speaking statue, is you insert a tube. He also had a tube that went from the entrance of the Roman College Museum all the way to his quarters, so that he could sort of speak, kind of oracle like the Wizard of Oz, out of this. And so manipulating sound, and these were experiments he did not only in the Roman College, but all over Rome. He used all sorts of amphitheaters and palaces to play with the sound of echoes, at the same time. When Queen Christina of Sweden visited the Roman College as part of her triumphal entry into Rome in 1655-56, when she had converted to Catholicism, one of the places that she was received was at the Roman College Museum, and besides building a tiny hieroglyphic obelisk simply for her, he also built an acoustic machine that became known as the Delphic Oracle. It was so popular among visitors at this time. And again, you can see from Kircher's books like his Musica Universalis that's published in 1650, you can see him being fascinated with and trying to replicate bird song, right? How would you literally musically annotate bird song? What is the, anatomy, right, of animal sound, of the human voice? And how can he feed all of these things into his world of machines? In many ways, I'm reminded about one of the texts that Kircher didn't know because he cites it in one of his books. In Galileo's Assayer, there's a wonderful passage in Galileo's Assayer that he wrote in the 1620s called The Fable of Sound, where he talks about the sort of how the curiosity of a philosopher who wants to know how the cicada makes its sound ends up killing the insect, right, because he finally pricks it to the point that it dies. And instead what Kircher does is he doesn't kill the messenger, he turns it into a machine. And as a result, one of the interesting roles that Kircher played in Rome in the middle of the 17th century was also as a kind of organ consultant. In the 1640s, we know that he was one of the people who worked on the restoration of one of the famous organs in Rome, the one in the Quirinale, which he then reproduces in his book. And you can see, again, this is one that has a figure of Pan, and two birds, and they all turn and move as you play the organ. But then he himself created organs for his museum, so that when people went to his museum, they would also hear sound, right, and see movement at the same time. Again, light, sound. This was a true sensorium, right, in which all of your senses were supposed to be stimulated. And this is one where you can see in this particular Pythagorean organ that he has an image of Vulcan and the Cyclops, who are all kind of pounding with their hammers, and then on the other side a skeleton who's sort of supervising, the elaboration of the Pythagorean scale as a little diorama, at the top. And there are just tons and tons of examples of this kind of stuff that he does. Not to be content with having mastered sound, light, the magnet, and a few other things, Kircher, by the 1660s, began to think also about how he could put language inside a machine. He had long been fascinated not just with the hieroglyphs, but with all sorts of secret and artificial languages. And so by this period, he began to return to his studies of language with the idea of the machine in mind, and to produce various sorts of writing machines. So one of the famous ones that he reproduced was his cryptographic machine, which had a series of magnets in it that allowed each thing to move simultaneously, pointing to the right letter. So again, the magnet, seemingly invisibly, produced the cipher. But what he also did was to begin to create the first of a series of arcs that he made in which he would contain all knowledge, right? He had a musical arc in which he put all of music, and he had a cryptographic chest in which he put every imaginable piece of language. And imagine that you could treat language like a calculator. In other words, this is again a kind of 17th century version of those sort of silly translation machines that people are supposed to use when they travel around, in which you write in, where is the airport, And it took even longer, needless to say, because it involved all these levers. So I don't think anyone actually ever used this, but it was an interesting metaphor for the problem of language, and one that was a highly productive metaphor for somebody who would ultimately, by the end of his life, produce a book about the Tower of Babel. And of course, I could not resist putting in Rachel Berwick's recreation of the Machina Cryptographica in the exhibit next door, and you can just, again, go back and forth on this for a second. As the 1660s wore on, Kircher also returned to one of the other great problems of the 17th century, which is the problem of metaphor. Not content simply to study some of the fabulous new mathematical machines of this period, like Pascal's calculating machine from earlier in the 17th century, Kircher himself sought to contribute, right, to the new image of a mathematical machine by creating what he called the mathematical organ. Now, Kircher initially created this single box, again containing all mathematical knowledge, for the 11-year-old Archduke Karl Joseph in 1661. And he sent this all the way to Vienna, and Karl Joseph and his tutors tried to use it and couldn't really figure out how it worked, which was the typical problem of Kircher's museum pieces. So they wrote back to Rome and they said, we don't really know how this works. So Kircher sort of writes and says, well, I'm too busy to really write up how my machine works, which is his typical answer to this kind of question about his machines. But my assistant Kaspar Schott, who at this point now is no longer in Rome but back in Würzburg, perhaps can help explain this to you. 850 pages later, Schott had finally explained it and died in the process. The necrology of the Jesuit order reported that Schott died of overwork, and indeed he did. And for the final decade of his life, he did nothing but publish books about Kircher's machines, all of them in thousands of pages of Latin filled with these illustrations. And so no one was more devoted than Kaspar Schott to the idea, the fantasy, right, of Kircher's machines. Now, all this is to say, as I kind of get to the concluding point of my talk here, that Kircher's machines were far more conceptual than practical. They worked, but only when the viewer was in the proper frame of mind to contemplate them. And one of the best examples of this is the machine for which Kircher is the most famous, because it's often claimed erroneously that he invented it, the magic lantern, right? If you look on cinematography sites and histories of cinematography, there's, the better ones will tell you that's not true, and they'll kind of get into the whole debate about who invented the magic lantern. But there still are all sorts of sites. There's even an Athanasius Kircher Award for cinematography that at least was around a few years ago when I was writing this volume with these friends, that, kind of replicates this popular idea that, he invented, the first image-producing machine. Kircher first provides an image of the magic lantern very late in his career, in his publication known as The Great Art of Light and Shadow. And The Great Art of Light and Shadow, his greatest book on optics and all sorts of allied subjects, is first published in 1646. No mention of the magic lantern. By 1671, he has put the magic lantern inside this book quite prominently. So why does he do this? The magic lantern had existed as an idea at least back, to the Renaissance, if not probably to antiquity, right? The idea of projecting images on the wall is something that we see fantastic descriptions of but no reality to, say, in the 15th century. And the best example of this is from Giovanni Fontana's Book of Machines from the 15th century, where you see him projecting a devil on the wall, which is indeed exactly the type of thing that people project in the 17th century when they actually make magic lanterns. Generally, if you look at histories of the magic lantern, people, I think, rightfully credit the Dutch experimental philosopher and mathematician Christian Huygens with probably inventing the idea of the magic lantern as a sort of game for his father, right? A family game in 1659, where he talks about projecting, devils on the wall. But he says, look, this is not really a serious instrument, as people ask him about it. But the idea catches on, and by the 1660s, there are all sorts of people claiming to invent the magic lantern. And I've shown you one diagram from actually a book by a far more obscure Swedish experimental philosopher from this period. So you can sort of see what this diagram, looks like. What does a standard magic lantern look like? Is it's got a candle, right? It's got the light source inside, and it's got, the concave mirror behind it, right, to magnify the light. Then the lens, a biconvex lens in front of it in the long tube. And between the lens and the light is the painted image, right, on glass that then was going to be projected outward. Okay, so that's the standard magic lantern. This instead is Kircher's lantern, and I've again given you a replica from the 18th century next to it, which looks quite different. So Kircher, first of all, realized by the time he re-edits The Great Art of Light and Shadow that he has to get the magic lantern into this book because this is one of the great new machines. How could he not have invented it? And the more he thinks about it, he said, how could I not have invented it? The more he thinks about it, he realized he did invent it, he just forgot to put it in the book, so he inserts it, But one of the noteworthy features that people have spent ages puzzling about, is why his lantern looks different, right? You can see the tube is on the inside. The tube is actually between, right, the flame, the candle, and the, and the slide, the glass slide. And then also peculiarly, the images that he projects on the wall, both in this one and his other images, are upright. If he was using a biconvex lens, they would be upside down. So the easy explanation has been, well, this is another example that he didn't actually do it, and he doesn't really know how the magic lantern works. But I fully agree with a Belgian colleague who's been working on this, that this is not the right answer. Right? And what he has argued in a recent article instead is that Kircher looks at that other magic lantern and deliberately rejects it because it does not serve his purpose, because what he sees the magic lantern being is not just a simple projecting device, but once again, a metaphysical machine with a point. All of the images that he projects are religious images, right? The image of death, here, or if I back up, the resurrection, the burning image, here. The devil, this is a machine, with a very strong moral message. And one of the most recent hypotheses is that Kircher reorients this machine so that he can also have the machine itself create the metaphysical message, that comes out of this. So, the perfect source of light, you begin with the perfect light. You then have the intrusion, of the more human form of this from an angelic lens, to a human lens, to then produce a much smaller, less dramatic image on the wall, but one that reflects the kind of progression, right, from the divine, to the human. As light travels, from the heavens to earth. So, it's something to debate, but it's a very interesting, I think, interpretation of the possibilities, and the thinking that went into many of his machines. Now, to conclude my meditation here on Kircher's machines, Athanasius Kircher was fascinated with all the different things that could be put into a box and rendered mechanical. And as I said earlier, I've been thinking, and I've again kind of put another piece from Rachel Berwick's exhibit in here, I've been thinking a lot about this. The way in which birds are constantly recycling through all of these things is the perfect object, right, to render mechanical in one form or another because they have motion and sound in them, though not light, right? But then the light illuminates these things in all sorts of different ways. Now, Kircher himself was no exception to that. And one of the last whimsical machines that he makes, but again with a moral message, was a paper dragon that's sort of like an early hot air balloon that he used to take out to a shrine that he had built outside of Rome, to sort of remind people who thought, that dragons arrived in the skies, that they perhaps mostly did not, right? And so he created this paper dragon on which he wrote in Latin, the ira Dei, the wrath of God, and he would sort of take this around the countryside and see how many people thought a real dragon, because he was up on a hill in the shrine of Mentorel, how many of the peasants in the countryside thought this was a real dragon, and how many of them instead, understood, the revelation, right? Not to be tricked by false miracles, right, but to wait for a true, and real and authentic miracle, right? The task of the instrumentalist was constantly to draw that division between the human and the divine while playing with it at the same time. I've argued elsewhere that Kircher himself was rather a machine. And to the extent that he was a machine, he was one of the other machines in his museum, the perpetual motion machine. This is next to Kircher's portrait is an image from Caspar, one of Caspar Schott's many books that he killed himself writing, of the wheels that make the perpetual motion machine work. Kircher was somebody who thought without end, who published without end, and who made things, right, from the beginning to the end of his life. And I think in many ways, he was not only the heir to Della Porta, but to another Southern Italian, the philosopher Tommaso Campanella, who also was a great practitioner of natural magic in the first half of the 17th century. Campanella wrote in one of his unpublished treatises from this period, "For technology is always called magic until it is understood." And this, I believe, was the central task, right, of Kircher's museums, to create with these machines a kind of process of understanding that never fully revealed everything, but invited you to contemplate what might be possible. Thank you very much. Oh, I would love to. Yes?
So, isn't the fact that he was licensed by the church, because he was like a professor at the Jesuit church, and that a lot of his machines were later repurposed in some way for experimental purposes, why do you think he always sort of focused on the effects that can be produced with these machines instead of investigating the actual causes or sort of science in general?
Yeah, I mean, he's always, exactly. Oh, maybe. So, I mean, the question is sort of about this. I mean, about the sort of Catholic world of, this, effects, right? I mean, in some level, this is something that the central issue about Kircher is to puzzle this issue of why, unlike Della Porta and Campanella, who are both, as Catholics, suspected of heresy and undergo inquisitorial trials, Campanella spends many years of his life in prison for his political beliefs, actually, even more than his intellectual heresies. What is it about Kircher that allows him to do all this stuff, and get away with it? I mean, one is these kind of constant professions of piety, right? That the effect is always supposed to be pious. But I think the other thing is that on some level, there is a kind of Catholic intellectual world, that is flirting with the possibilities, right, of the power of nature, right, and the power of transformation. Because in the end, if you take all of the magic out of religion, you run the risk of becoming Protestant. And that's exactly what they don't want to do. So as I think about it, I mean, this may not be entirely answering your question, but I hope it gets kind of in the right direction, is that on some level, this is an interesting way to kind of bring it all back, and yet with a sort of modern message. I mean, in a weird way, I see it as being a kind of interesting 17th century predecessor to one of the important 18th century projects, which is to kind of reform canonization proceedings with the new anatomy of this period. The Pope Benedict XIV, prior to being Pope, writes what still nowadays is the modern text on canonization, and he uses his knowledge of all of the developments in anatomy, the anatomical revolution of the 17th and early 18th centuries, to sort of tell you how, when you read the body, you should be able to recognize all the things that are not miracles, right? And therefore, you're going to really know a true miracle. I mean, that kind of stripping away of knowledge, is an interesting process, because in the end there are still true miracles, right? In the end for Kircher also there are still true miracles. He's not a skeptic, he's not Descartes, for instance, by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I mean, the two of them were, I think, literally incomprehensible to each other, even though they lived in the same world.
So do you think the church pressure has prevented him from using these as sort of experimental devices? Like you talked about?
No, I don't think they prevent him at all. I don't think he was restrained in any way. In fact, this was one of the enormous frustrations of his fellow Jesuits, that he, many of them felt that he was often publishing truly awful books because he published these things so fast. He made tons and tons of errors, in these books, and so I'm left still with the view that he, for him this was from beginning to end a religious project, right? I don't think he ever had any desire to step outside of that image of what he was doing, and what he did was to kind of absorb all the knowledge of his time and all the excitement about new things, and always ask himself, so what can a Catholic do with them? Now, a different kind of Catholic, say Galileo, right, or Descartes, did something very different with those things and didn't see that as being incompatible, but neither of them were Jesuits, right, Jesuits who, restored shrines outside of Rome, for instance, which is a true act of piety, right? Nothing could be more pious than that. But Kircher would say that in many ways the Roman College Museum was also a shrine, to his faith.
I have a comment. I think what's interesting about him is that he had one foot in the past and one foot in the future. He was a neo-medievalist on the one hand, one day, and the next day he could be a rationalist. Back and forth. I think that's very curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I really do think of that as the kind of project of modernity in the 17th century. I mean, you've captured it exactly well. I mean, there's so many things about him that are very scholastic, and yet, scholastic, but scholasticism combined with natural magic, which is supposedly condemned by the church, but only if it's demonic, so, by constantly drawing that distinction, he stays within bounds. And at the same time, he's sort of saying, yes, I mean, the world of instruments has arrived, and we have to incorporate this. In this respect, he is like many of the Jesuit scientists in this period, right, who all of them are, however they do their work, whether they're very technically oriented, mathematically oriented, in a way that Kircher was not, or interested in observation, or just interested in, making books of machines. I mean, all of them recognized that they couldn't just simply do the kind of old-style scholasticism. I mean, that they had to change with the times. And I mean, I think that it's not surprising that the Jesuit order, which was a new order after all, was at the vanguard of that. I mean, it was a new order. It was an order that was at the forefront of creating a whole educational infrastructure for Catholic Europe and for the Catholic world, very quickly, right? The vanguard of the missionary effort. As I've written about elsewhere, some of Kircher's best readers were in places like Puebla and Mexico City, because these books traveled through the Jesuit missionary networks, and people looked at these machines and asked, how can I reproduce them, and wrote Kircher fan letters because they knew they could do that from anywhere in the world, from China or Mexico. You could write to Rome and kind of virtually meet this author. And so that also was part of the modernity, right? The world was so much larger for someone like Kircher, so he kind of created his books and machines with a kind of eye to this new, the kind of early modern globalization as well. Yes?
You mentioned early on that for Kircher, making machines was a way of revealing faith. And I'm wondering if there was any aspect of that that was based on the power-based model. So for instance, for something like your bombing lobster, was he taking that to say anything about the physiological processes of the way a natural thing works? Or were all of these machines just, oh, look, I can do something cool, that means I understand these processes?
I think that he is always, well, I would say, like, the vomiting lobster, I don't think he's trying to tell you anything about a lobster, alas, right? I would love to think that, because lobsters are very interesting, but I don't see Kircher as being that kind of naturalist, right, who really kind of looked at the lobster, say, as a lobster, and then tried to make a lobster machine. But, so in that instance, I'd say, no, that's a throwaway, this is definitely pure spectacle. And the same would say the magnetic oracle, right, where, there's, what he's demonstrating there is really more a kind of spectacle of, a machine you can ask questions of, and get the answers from. But in other instances, I do think that he's demonstrating what he believes to be the physical principles of the universe, and he's defending them. I mean, to go back to the earlier question about how he's kind of treading a certain line, right? There are certain questions that the Jesuits need to defend, the less modern perspective on, right? They need to say that a vacuum does not exist in nature. So, and they know that to say this, they need to demonstrate this, right? So they need to demonstrate the non-existence of the vacuum. And so what they say is, well, we can see, that a space has been created, but we don't know what's inside of it. We're not going to, we see the effect, but we're not going to investigate the cause of that. We see that an air pump seems to have certain effects, right? But we don't really know exactly, whether you've sucked all the air out of that. We see that some people think that the sun is the center of our cosmos, but, we can agree that there are many new observations out there without being convinced of that, right? And so Kircher is, constantly kind of, he's kind of sort of towing the line about he, in theory has to show that his museum adheres to the official Catholic astronomy. His little models of the universe, cannot be pro-Copernican, in any overt way, but he's allowed to show it as an interesting, if flawed, hypothesis next to the current Jesuit model, which is a kind of hybrid between ancient and modern astronomy at this time. So, I mean, he's instrumental up to a point, and that's where, the point at which he stops is the point at which we often want to pick up, right? Because we want him to do what Descartes does, right, or Galileo or Newton, and really inquire into this thing with that instrument in a way that we think he should. And he would say instead, no, what I'm trying to do with these instruments is to demonstrate principles I already know, right? The instrument is not a resource for discovering something, and that's where his attitude towards the instrument is not new at all, right? I mean, Galileo immediately understands that the telescope is an instrument that will allow him to see new things. And he gets even people who don't believe in his vision of the cosmos to acknowledge that those new things are there, even if they won't explain them the way he does. And Kircher, his views of magnetism don't really change because of all these instruments. And unlike Newton, whose experiments with the magnet do lead him to change his views about, what the hidden forces are of the world, and lead him on to bigger and greater and even more abstract things than this little, piece, right, of curious piece of nature.